Barron Trump had always felt like a shadow in his own life, a life surrounded by wealth, privilege, and attention, yet marked by a constant sense of isolation. His father was one of the most powerful men in the world, and Barron, often seen as a quiet, reserved son, was expected to follow in the footsteps of greatness. But the path was never clear to him. His days felt like a blur, an endless string of meetings, photo ops, and events where he was more of a spectator than a participant. He often found solace in the quiet corners of the mansion, the scent of leather from the family library, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside, and the soft creak of the floorboards as he walked alone. He could hear the distant hum of city life just outside his window, but it always seemed so far away, like a world he didn't quite belong to. The weight of expectations hung over him, pressing down on his chest, suffocating him, as if everyone around him had already decided what he should be. The mansion was a constant reminder of his father's empire, a place where success was the only measure worth. But to Barron, success felt like a distant dream, a goal he was never quite sure how to reach. Every day, he fought to stay focused, to ignore the whispers of those around him who believed he should be more, do more, be more. But it wasn't until one moment, one defining event, that everything in his life would shift, bringing him to the edge of something bigger than he could have ever imagined. It was just another afternoon when it happened. He was standing in the hallway of his high school, Sterling Academy, his mind preoccupied with the latest calculus test. The pressure was mounting, but as usual, he didn't let it show. His strides were measured, almost methodical as he made his way to class. The world around him seemed ordinary. Students talking in the halls, the usual chatter of lockers slamming shut, footsteps echoing against the marble floors. But then he turned the corner. There, blocking his path, was Grant Wheeler. Tall, blond, and built like a linebacker, Grant stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the lockers as if the space was his to control. He was one of the most popular students at Sterling, a symbol of privilege and power among the student body. To most, Grant was untouchable. And to Barron, he was a constant reminder of everything he wasn't. "You lost, Barron?" Grant sneered, his voice laced with mockery as he eyed Barron with a condescending smirk. "This place is way above your head." Barron didn't flinch. He had faced Grant's taunt before, but today something felt different. The usual sting of his words didn't affect him in the way it had in the past. This time, there was a quiet resolve in Barron's chest, a feeling he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Grant, taking in the way his posture oozed arrogance. The way he looked down at everyone around him, the weight of his father's legacy. The pressure to always be perfect had worn Barron down, but in this moment, it also gave him a newfound clarity. "Move, Grant," Barron said, his voice calm yet firm. "I'm not in the mood for your games." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Barron felt something shift in the space between them. But Grant only laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the hallway. He pushed off from the lockers and stepped closer to Barron, his presence looming over him. "You really think you can talk to me like that?" Grant's voice was a sneer, dripping with disdain. "This place isn't for you, Barron. You don't belong here." He shoved Barron hard, sending him stumbling backward. Barron caught himself just before hitting the wall, but the impact of the shove, the challenge in Grant's eyes, was undeniable. It was a warning, a test of who Barron truly was. A few students had gathered around, their phones already out, recording the scene unfolding before them. This wasn't just about bullying anymore. It was a spectacle. Barron's heart raced. His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't react. He stood his ground, eyes locked with Grant's, refusing to let the situation unfold the way it always had. "You really don't want to do this," Barron said, his voice steady despite the chaos building in his chest. Grant's lips curled into an even wider grin. "Or what? You gonna cry to a teacher? Go ahead, Barron. Show them how weak you really are." Another shove, harder this time. The crowd tensed, their eyes glued to the scene. This was the moment Barron had been avoiding for so long. His thoughts raced, and in the midst of the noise around him, a single thought echoed louder than any other. This was his breaking point. If this story resonated with you and made you think, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What would you do if you were in Barron's shoes? Do you think he should have stood up to Grant, or would you have done things differently? Let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to join our community. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Every like and comment helps us keep bringing you more powerful stories like this one, and your support makes all the difference. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Barron couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him after the confrontation with Grant. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but now there was something else, a quiet, simmering anger mixed with a deep sense of clarity. For the first time in years, Barron felt as though he could see beyond the expectations that had always hung over him. As he walked the rest of the way to his calculus class, he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. Grant's smirk, the crowd watching, and the shove that had sent him stumbling backward. But what stuck with Barron the most wasn't the humiliation. It was the way he had stood there, staring Grant down without backing down. The bell rang, snapping Barron out of his thoughts. He pushed the door open and walked into the classroom, trying to ignore the whispers from his classmates as he sat at his desk. As usual, everyone had something to say, but this time Barron didn't care. He wasn't going to let the noise distract him anymore. But despite his outward calm, Barron couldn't escape the weight of the day's events. Every time his thoughts drifted back to the hallway, the same question lingered in the back of his mind. What now? It wasn't long before Barron realized that his confrontation with Grant hadn't just made him a target. It had made him an even bigger outcast. The whispers that followed him in the hallways weren't just about Grant's cruel taunts anymore. No, they were about him now. They spoke in hushed tones about the son of the president who couldn't even stand up to a bully. The worst part? Barron couldn't argue with them. For years, he had let the world dictate who he was and how he was supposed to act. But now, after what happened in the hallway, he realized that the only thing he had left to prove was that he was more than the label people had slapped onto him. He was tired of being the silent, invisible son of a powerful man. Later that day, as Barron walked out of class, his mind still spinning, he was met with a text message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Meet me at the gym after school. No cameras. Let's settle this." Barron stared at the screen for a moment, uncertainty creeping into his chest. What does he want now? But before he could think it through, another text arrived, this time from his best friend, Matt. "Are you going to meet him?" "I wouldn't. It's a trap, man." But Barron had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to run anymore. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Barron made his way to the gym. The halls were quieter now, with most of the students either gone or headed home. The gym was eerily silent, the only sound being the faint echo of his footsteps on the polished floor. He pushed the door open, and for a brief moment, the emptiness of the space made him hesitate. The high ceilings loomed above him. The championship banners hanging from the rafters seemed to mock his uncertainty. But there, standing in the middle of the gym, was Grant Wheeler. But Grant wasn't alone. Behind him stood three of his friends, Hunter, Mason, and Tyler. Barron's stomach tightened, but he didn't flinch. This was a moment. He had no choice but to face it head-on. "So, you decided to show up," Grant said, his tone dripping with condescension. "What's the matter, Barron? You scared?" Barron didn't respond immediately. He was acutely aware of the four boys watching him, their eyes full of judgment, ready to tear him down. But he stood tall, his jaw clenched. "I'm not here to fight you, Grant," Barron said, his voice steady, though there was a fire burning behind his words. "I'm here to prove something to myself." Grant smirked, taking a step closer. "Prove what?" "That you're not as weak as I thought." Barron's hands curled into fists. He had tried to avoid this, tried to walk away from the confrontation. But now there was no turning back. The weight of his decision was heavy, but it was the right one. He wasn't going to back down anymore. Not to Grant, not to anyone. He met Grant's eyes, feeling the tension in the room rise. "Know that I'm stronger than you think." And just like that, the air around them seemed to crackle with the intensity of the moment. Barron knew that the path ahead was uncertain, but in that instant, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Control. Barron's heart raced as he stood in the middle of the gym, the tension thick in the air. Grant Wheeler and his friends were all around him, their eyes filled with judgment, ready to pounce. Barron could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. This was it, the moment where he would either break or rise to challenge. For a brief second, Barron wondered if he had made a mistake coming here. What if it was a trap? What if Grant and his friends were just looking for an excuse to humiliate him further? The doubts crept in, but Barron quickly pushed them aside. He wasn't here to fight, but to prove that he wasn't going to let anyone push him around anymore. Not Grant. Not anyone. Grant took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with mockery. You think you can stand up to me? You're nothing, Barron. Just a spoiled rich kid with daddy's name. Barron's fists clenched at his sides, but he stayed silent. Grant was right about one thing. Barron had grown up with the silver spoon. His life had been one of luxury and privilege, but that didn't mean he hadn't faced his own battles. People always assumed that because he had money, his life was perfect, but they didn't know what it felt like to always be under someone's thumb, to always be compared to a man who cast a long shadow. Barron felt the anger building inside him, but he took a deep breath to calm himself. This wasn't about proving something to Grant. It was about proving something to himself. You don't know anything about me, Barron said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. You think you can talk down to me because of who my father is. But I'm not him, and I'm not going to let you push me around. Grant chuckled, clearly unimpressed. Oh, I know exactly what you are. A little boy playing at being tough. You don't belong here. This school isn't for people like you. Barron could feel the crowd's eyes on him, but he refused to look away. He had faced worse than this. The constant pressure to be perfect, to live up to expectations. Those were the real battles he fought every day. This was nothing. Suddenly, one of Grant's friends, Hunter, lunged at Barron. Without thinking, Barron sidestepped, avoiding the attack with ease. Hunter stumbled forward, off balance, and Barron took the opportunity to push him away, just enough to send him sprawling to the floor. The crowd gasped, their murmurs growing louder. Barron felt a surge of adrenaline, but he didn't let it control him. He stayed focused, his eyes locked on Grant. The others, Mason and Tyler, were still waiting, hovering like sharks in the water, waiting for the right moment to strike. Grant's smirk faltered for a split second. He hadn't expected Barron to fight back. Barron could see the hesitation in his eyes, and for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was his chance to show them that he wasn't just some rich kid who didn't know how to stand up for himself. But then, Grant's face darkened, and he took another step forward, his fists clenched. You think this is over, Barron? You're weak. You don't have what it takes to survive in this world. Barron's heart pounded, but he held his ground. His body was tense, ready for whatever came next. I've been underestimated my whole life, Barron said, his voice low but fierce. And I've had enough. Without warning, Grant lunged at him, throwing a wild punch. Barron dodged easily, his movements fluid and practiced. His mind raced, but for the first time in a long while, he felt in control. He wasn't the scared boy who had walked into this gym earlier. He was someone else now. He twisted his body, grabbing Grant's arm and using his momentum to throw him off balance. In one swift motion, Barron flipped Grant over his shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor. The gym fell silent. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire world had stopped. Barron stood over Grant, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. The silence in the gym was deafening, broken only by the sound of Grant groaning on the floor. Barron didn't feel victorious, but he did feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Power. He looked down at Grant, his voice steady. I'm not afraid of you. The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering, others laughing. Barron felt the weight of the moment, the power of his own action, but he didn't let it go to his head. This wasn't about the cheers or the attention. This was about the message he had sent. The gym buzzed with excitement as Barron stood there, his chest still rising and falling from the adrenaline of the confrontation. The crowd's cheers were still echoing in his ears, but he couldn't let them distract him. This was his moment. But it wasn't about the applause or the praise. It was about the shift inside him, the sense that he had finally taken control of his own story. Barron's eyes flicked down to Grant, who was still lying on the gym floor, trying to push himself up. His face was flushed with embarrassment, his pride shattered in front of everyone. But Barron didn't feel sympathy. For the first time in his life, he wasn't concerned with what others thought of him. He had made a stand, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But as he stood there, looking down at Grant, a realization hit him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Barron turned on his heel and walked out of the gym, the sound of his footsteps drowning out the lingering noise behind him. He didn't know what to expect in the aftermath of his actions, but one thing was clear. His life was about to change. The next day, the halls of Sterling Academy felt different. The air was thick with whispers, but instead of the usual murmur of gossip that followed him, Barron felt a strange mix of curiosity and awe. He was still the same person he had been before the confrontation. Quiet, reserved, but now he carried himself differently. There was a new sense of strength in his posture, a new confidence in his eyes. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed students giving him looks, some of admiration, others of fear. He could feel the shift, and it was both exhilarating and unnerving. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the change that was happening so quickly, but one thing was for sure. He was no longer the invisible son of the president. "Hey, Barron, that was impressive yesterday," one of his classmates, Emily, said as she passed him in the hallway. "I didn't know you had it in you." Barron turned to face her, surprised by the genuine smile on her face. For a moment, he was speechless. Was this what it felt like to be seen? To be acknowledged for something other than your last name? "Thanks," he muttered, feeling a little awkward. As he continued walking, Barron realized that the world was reacting to him in a way it never had before. People were looking at him, not just as a son of Donald Trump, but as someone who had the courage to stand up for himself. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and it felt good. That afternoon, as Barron sat at lunch, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from the table next to him. His name came up repeatedly, but not in the way he was used to hearing it. No longer was he just a curiosity or a footnote in the story of his father's legacy. Now, people were talking about him because of what he had done. "I heard Barron flip Grant Wheeler yesterday. Can you believe it?" one girl whispered, her voice full of awe. "Yeah, I heard he's different now. Like, really different. Like, he's not afraid anymore," another girl added. Barron wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, it was strange to hear people discussing him so openly. But on the other hand, it felt like validation. He had stood up for himself, and now others were starting to notice. It was more than just a physical act of flipping Grant over his shoulder. It was a fact that Barron had chosen not to back down. That choice had sparked something, and now it was rippling through his life. But as the day went on, Barron realized that not everyone was happy about his newfound reputation. There were still whispers of doubt, people who didn't believe he could change or who didn't trust his motivations. And then there was Grant. Barron hadn't seen him since the gym, but he knew one thing for sure. Grant wasn't going to let this go. The bullying might have stopped for now, but Barron had made an enemy, and Grant would do whatever it took to destroy him. Later that evening, Barron sat alone in his room, thinking about the events of the day. His phone buzzed with messages from friends, congratulating him on standing up to Grant. But the excitement of the moment was fading, replaced by a lingering sense of uncertainty. The world had changed around him, but Barron wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences. As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, Barron asked himself, what now? He had faced down Grant Wheeler, but he hadn't won anything. Not really. The real challenge was coming. He could feel it. It was like a storm gathering on the horizon, and he was standing right in its path. But Barron wasn't afraid anymore. He had found something inside himself that he didn't know existed. A strength, a determination to be more than the person everyone expected him to be. And he wasn't about to let that go. Barron just took a big step, but the road ahead is far from easy. What do you think will happen next? Will he be able to handle the pressure? Drop your thoughts in the comment below. And if you want to keep following Barron's journey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support makes all the difference in bringing more powerful stories like this one to life. The days following the gym incident felt like a blur for Barron. On the outside, everything seemed to return to normal. The school day went on as usual, the buzz about his confrontation with Grant slowly dying down. But Barron knew better. The change wasn't in the world around him. It was in himself. Something inside had shifted, and there was no going back. The moment he had flipped Grant, he felt a rush of power, but also a deep sense of clarity. Standing there, watching Grant struggle to get back up, Barron had felt more alive than he ever had before. For the first time, he had taken control of his own destiny, rather than allowing it to be dictated by his last name or the expectations of others. But as the world around him moved on, Barron couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Grant might have been humiliated, but that didn't mean the fight was over. Barron knew Grant would want revenge, and that made Barron more nervous than he'd like to admit. The first sign that the storm wasn't over came during the next morning's class. Barron was sitting in the back of the room, quietly trying to focus on the lesson, when he noticed a group of Grant's friends glaring at him from across the room. They didn't say anything, but the animosity in their eyes was clear. Barron could feel the weight of their stares, and it made his stomach tighten with unease. He had always tried to stay out of the spotlight, but now he had a target on his back. Matt, his closest friend, leaned over and whispered in his ear, "You're really going to keep pushing Grant like that? He won't let this slide. You've made a powerful enemy." Barron glanced at Matt, feeling a pang of doubt. "I don't know, man. I thought standing up to him would make it stop, but I guess I was wrong." Matt gave him a sympathetic look. "It's not over, Barron. Grant's not the kind of guy who takes losing lightly. He'll come for you one way or another." Barron couldn't argue with that. The truth was, he had expected some form of retaliation from Grant, but it didn't make it any easier to face. What if Grant's next move was more than Barron could handle? What if this was the start of something much bigger than he had prepared for? After school, Barron found himself wandering through the halls, deep in thought. The weight of his decision was starting to sink in. Standing up to Grant had been liberating, but now the responsibility of his actions was starting to feel like a burden. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had made his choice, and now he had to deal with the fallout. As Barron made his way to his locker, he noticed a few students gathering near the entrance to the gym. His curiosity piqued. He walked closer to see what was going on. It was Grant, and this time he wasn't alone. Grant's crew stood by his side, looking just as intimidating as ever. They were laughing, making jokes, but Barron could tell that something serious was brewing. As he approached, Grant looked up and caught his eye, his smile quickly fading into a cold, calculating stare. Well, Grant said, his voice dripping with venom. "Look who decided to show up." Barron felt his heart race, but he kept his composure. "What do you want, Grant?" Grant stepped forward, his friends trailing behind him like a pack of wolves. "I think it's time we settle this once and for all, Barron. You and me. No more games. No more hiding." Barron could feel the tension building in the air. This wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about proving who was in control. But Barron wasn't going to let Grant intimidate him. Not again. "I'm not afraid of you, Grant," Barron said, his voice steady. Grant laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You should be." The confrontation was inevitable. Barron knew this. He had expected it. And yet, standing there, facing Grant and his crew, he felt the weight of his decisions crash down on him. He had already stood up once, but was he ready to do it again? Barron didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to back down. The hallway felt like a battlefield, and Barron was standing right in the middle of it. But this time, he wasn't alone. His friends, his classmates, they had all witnessed his strength the day he stood up to Grant. They knew what he was capable of. And Barron realized, for the first time, that he didn't have to fight this battle alone. His heart pounded in his chest. But this time, he felt ready. He had already fought the hardest battle, standing up for himself. Now, the world would see that he wasn't someone to be overlooked. He wasn't someone to be pushed around. Barron took a deep breath and stepped forward. The confrontation wasn't over, but it was only just beginning. Barron had expected some kind of retaliation after his stand against Grant, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. The tension in the air at Sterling Academy was palpable. Everywhere Barron went, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some looked at him with admiration, others with fear, but none dared speak to him directly. Grant's crew had made it clear that Barron wasn't going to get away with what he had done. They had been quiet in the days following the gym incident, but Barron could feel the storm building. It wasn't a matter of if, but when Grant would make his move. And when it happened, Barron knew it would be worse than the last confrontation. This time, there would be no turning back. It was a Friday afternoon when Barron received the call. He had been in the library, working on a paper for history class, when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but Barron answered anyway, his heart skipping a beat as he heard the voice on the other end. "Barron." Grant's voice was cold, laced with malice. "Meet me at the basketball court after school. I've got something to show you. Come alone." The line went dead before Barron could say anything. His stomach churned, but he wasn't afraid. The fear that once plagued him, the uncertainty about standing up for himself, was gone. He had already made his choice. But still, a gnawing feeling of dread lingered in the pit of his stomach. Later that day, Barron walked toward the basketball court, the setting sun casting long shadows across the empty yard. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of his thoughts. As he neared the court, he could see Grant and his friends waiting near the bleachers, their postures stiff and tense. Grant was standing in the middle, his arms crossed, his face a mask of anger and control. The other boys, Hunter, Mason, and Tyler, stood in a loose formation around him, their eyes focused on Barron as he approached. Well, Grant said with a sneer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Looks like the little rich boy is brave enough to show up after all." Barron didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "What do you want, Grant?" Grant smiled, a dangerous, knowing smile. "Oh, it's not what I want, Barron. It's what you've earned. You think you can just walk around here acting like you own the place? Acting like you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. You'll never be more than your father's son." Barron felt his fists clench, the words stinging more than he wanted to admit. But he wasn't going to let them get to him. He wasn't going to let Grant win by showing weakness. "I'm not afraid of you, Grant," Barron said through gritted teeth. Grant stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You should be," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't get to challenge me and walk away unscathed." Without warning, Grant lunged at Barron, his fists aimed at Barron's face. Barron barely had time to react, but his instincts kicked in. He dodged the first punch, but Grant was quick, throwing another and another. Barron ducked, narrowly avoiding the blows, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't ready for this, not this level of aggression, but he had no choice now. He had to fight. Barron took a deep breath, steadying himself. His body moved with purpose, dodging Grant's punches and countering with quick jabs to Grant's sides. The gym had been the first confrontation, but this was different. This was real. There was no crowd, no audience to cheer him on. It was just him and Grant, and Barron knew that if he didn't stand up now, everything he had worked for would be in vain. Grant, furious, backed Barron into the corner of the court, the force of his blows pushing Barron's back against the metal post of the basketball hoop. Barron's body screamed in pain, but he refused to give in. He refused to let this bully have the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Grant raised his fist for another strike, but Barron acted quickly. With a burst of energy, he ducked under Grant's punch, twisted his body, and threw Grant to the ground with a move he had learned from self-defense training. The sound of Grant hitting the ground echoed in the empty court, a deafening reminder of how far Barron had come. Barron stood over Grant, panting, his body bruised and sore. For a moment, there was silence. Grant lay on the ground, stunned, his chest heaving with the effort to catch his breath. His eyes were wide, disbelief flashing across his face. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Barron had taken the power back. Barron didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. He turned away from Grant, ignoring the stunned looks of the other boys as he walked off the court, leaving Grant behind, lying in the dust. As Barron left the court, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But there was also a quiet realization creeping into his mind. He had fought for his dignity, for his place in the world. But the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Barron walked away from the basketball court with a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. He had just defeated Grant, humiliated him in front of his friends, and walked away with his head held high. But there was something about the victory that felt incomplete. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders, and for the first time, Barron realized that winning wasn't the end of the battle. It was just another beginning. As he made his way down the hallway, Barron could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were in awe, others in fear, but all of them were talking about him. It wasn't just about Grant anymore. It was about him, about who he was and what he had done. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Barron pulled it out to find a message from Matt. "You good? That was crazy. I can't believe you actually did it. But be careful, man. Grant's not going to take this lightly." Barron couldn't help but smile at Matt's concern. He was right. Grant wouldn't just let this go. Barron's actions had drawn a line in the sand, and now he was waiting for the consequences to come crashing down. Later that evening, Barron found himself sitting alone in his room, staring at the reflection in the mirror. The victory had felt sweet in the moment. But now, as the adrenaline faded, Barron felt a sense of unease. He had stood up for himself, proved he wasn't just some weak kid who would always hide behind his father's name. But what now? What would life look like after this? The truth was, Barron didn't know. He hadn't planned for any of this. One moment he had been walking through the halls, trying to keep his head down, and the next, he was in the middle of a battle for his reputation, his dignity, and his future. He closed his eyes, trying to push the doubt away, but it lingered. Was this really the beginning of something new? Or had he just made a target of himself, putting a huge bullseye on his back? The next morning, Barron was back at school, but everything had changed. The moment he stepped onto grounds of Sterling Academy, he could feel the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. The whispers that had followed him before were now more pronounced, more deliberate. He could hear the students talking about him, pointing and staring as he walked by. Barron had always been a quiet, introverted person, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But now, the spotlight was on him whether he liked it or not. As he entered his first class, Barron sat down at his desk and tried to focus on a lesson, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was watching him. All eyes were on him, some with curiosity, others with judgment. He felt the heat of their stares, the weight of their expectations. And then there it was, the first message of the day. "Hey, Barron." A voice whispered from behind him. Barron turned to see Emily, one of the more popular girls in school, giving him a nervous smile. "Are you okay? You know, after what happened with Grant." Barron didn't know how to respond. He was still processing everything, trying to figure out what came next. But as he looked at Emily, he realized something important. He wasn't the only one who had been affected by the events of the past few days. Everyone at Sterling had been watching. They had all witnessed his stand, his refusal to back down. "I'm fine," Barron said, his voice steady. "Just figuring things out." Emily nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Barron she wasn't the only one who had been affected. She had seen his fight. She had seen the man who had stood up and taken control of his own fate. "Just be careful," she said quietly. "Grant's not going to forget this." Barron nodded, his stomach sinking. He knew she was right. Grant wouldn't stop until he had made Barron pay for what happened. But Barron wasn't going to back down. He had taken the first step toward changing his life. He wasn't going to let Grant or anyone else take that away from him. Later that day, Barron was walking through the hallways when he saw Grant and his friends standing by the lockers. Grant's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Barron felt the weight of the challenge hanging in the air between them. This wasn't over. Barron had made a powerful enemy, and the real fight was just beginning. But Barron didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He had already taken control once, and he would do it again. As he walked past them, Grant sneered. "You think this is over, Barron?" he spat. "You're going to regret ever standing up to me." Barron didn't respond. He kept walking, his shoulders squared and his head held high. He wasn't afraid of Grant anymore. He wasn't afraid of anyone. He had taken the first step toward becoming the person he was always meant to be, and no one, not Grant, not his classmates, and certainly not his own doubts, was going to stop him now. Barron has faced Grant and come out on top, but what's next? Do you think he can handle pressure? What would you do if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below. If you're hooked on Barron's journey, Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Your support helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories. Like, share, and join our community today. The days after Barron's confrontation with Grant felt like a whirlwind. While Barron had stood his ground, earning the respect of many, he also made a powerful enemy who wasn't about to let go of the defeat so easily. The tension in the air around Sterling Academy had only escalated. Grant Wheeler had a reputation for making people regret crossing him, and Barron was no exception. Every glance, every whisper, felt like a silent challenge, a reminder that the fight was far from over. But Barron wasn't going to let it consume him. He couldn't afford to. He had worked too hard to stand up for himself, to show the world that he wasn't just another rich kid who could be pushed around. He wasn't going to lose that newfound strength. It was a Monday morning when Barron first noticed a shift. He was walking to class when he saw a group of students standing near the lockers, speaking in hushed tones. They were talking about him, again, but this time, the whispers didn't feel like admiration. There was something else in the air, something darker. Barron's stomach churned, and he quickened his pace, but the unease didn't go away. As he reached the door to his first class, he saw Matt standing by his locker, looking concerned. "Hey, man," Matt said, lowering his voice. "You've got to hear this." Barron frowned. "What's going on?" "I heard Grant's planning something." "He's pissed, Barron. He's telling people he's going to take you down, once and for all." Barron's chest tightened. He had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made the fear real. "What is he planning?" Matt looked around before speaking again. "Some of the guys are saying he's going to expose something about your family. You know, your dad. Something that could ruin your reputation here. He's trying to hit you where it hurts." Barron's heart skipped a beat. His father's name had always been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave him opportunities others could only dream of. On the other hand, it made him an easy target. Everyone expected him to be like his father, to be as powerful as unshakable. And when Barron didn't live up to those expectations, people didn't hesitate to use his family as ammunition. But Barron wasn't going to let that happen. He had already proven he was strong enough to fight for himself. Now, it was time to prove he could handle the truth. Whatever Grant was planning, Barron would face it head-on. "I won't let him use that against me," Barron said, his voice resolute. "I'll handle it." Matt looked at him, concerned but supportive. "Just be careful, Barron. Grant doesn't play fair." Barron gave a small nod. He appreciated Matt's concern, but he wasn't going to back down now. He couldn't. Not after everything he had already been through. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Barron couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the storm was just beginning. The whispers around him were growing louder, and he knew that Grant's next move was coming soon. That afternoon, as Barron sat in the library, trying to focus on his work, he couldn't help but glance around. There were still people talking about him, their eyes lingering just a little too long. It was like the entire school was holding its breath, waiting for the next dramatic chapter to unfold. Barron didn't know what Grant had planned, but he couldn't afford to wait and find out. He needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of control. Barron made a decision then. He wouldn't let Grant control the narrative. He would confront the rumors head-on. If Grant wanted to expose something, then Barron would face it on his terms. The next day, Barron called an impromptu meeting with his closest friends, Matt, Emily, and a few others who had supported him since the incident with Grant. They gathered in a quiet corner of the cafeteria, Barron's mind racing as he explained the situation. "Grant's going to try and ruin my reputation," Barron said, his voice low but steady. "He's going to try and use my family against me, but I'm not going to let him win." Matt looked concerned. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to confront it. Head on. If Grant thinks he can control my life by using my father's name, then he's wrong." Emily nodded in agreement. "You don't have to do this alone, Barron. We've got your back." Barron felt a surge of gratitude for his friends. He had never realized how much he needed them until this moment. But now, as he looked around at their faces, he realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. He didn't have to prove himself to anyone but himself. And that was enough. That afternoon, Barron confronted Grant in the school courtyard. It was a risk. He knew that. But he wasn't going to back down. He had already fought for his dignity, and now he was going to fight for his future. Grant was standing by the entrance to the gym, talking to a group of his friends. When he saw Barron approaching, he sneered, his arrogance evident in the way he stood. "You still don't get it, do you?" Grant taunted, crossing his arms. "You've made a mess of things, Barron. You think you can just walk away from what happened? You think you can just walk around here like nothing's changed?" Barron stood tall, his eyes locked on Grant's. "I'm not going anywhere, Grant. You can't control me. You can't control my life. I'm done letting you use my family as a weapon." Grant laughed, his friends joining in. "You really think you can just change everything by standing up to me? It doesn't work like that, Barron. You're not the hero here. You're just the son of a man who's too powerful to let you get away with this." Barron felt his fists clench at his sides, but he didn't let the anger consume him. "You want to bring my father into this? Fine, but that doesn't define who I am. I'm not my father. I'm me, and I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've worked for." Grant's smirk faded slightly, but his voice remained mocking. "We'll see about that." Barron didn't flinch. He had said what he needed to say. Now, it was time to let his actions speak louder than words. The next few days felt like a ticking clock for Barron. Ever since the confrontation in the courtyard, the pressure had only increased. Every hallway, every classroom, every glance from a student, Barron could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. The whispers had turned into full-blown rumors, and it felt like the whole school was watching his every move. Grant had said the worst was yet to come, and Barron knew he wasn't wrong. As much as Barron tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was on the horizon, something he wasn't ready for. And it was only a matter of time before that storm hit. It was the middle of the week when Barron received a text message that would change everything. The number was familiar, but it still sent a chill down his spine. "Meet me at the old gym after school. Don't bring anyone. You won't like what's coming." Barron stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. He didn't need to ask who it was. The message was clear. Grant was making his move, and Barron had no choice but to face it. As the final bell rang, Barron didn't go to his usual spot to meet his friends. Instead, he walked out of school and headed toward the old gym, the one that had been abandoned for years. The building was dark, dusty, and rarely used. Except now, it seemed like the perfect place for final confrontation. Barron's steps echoed to the empty hallways as he walked toward the back of the gym, his stomach twisted in knots. But he didn't hesitate. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. When Barron pushed open the heavy doors, the first thing he noticed was the dim lighting. The gym was eerily quiet, the silence almost deafening. Grant was standing in the middle of the floor, his arms crossed, surrounded by his crew. Hunter, Mason, and Tyler were there, but there was something different about them. They weren't laughing or joking like they usually did. They were serious, intimidating. "Barron," Grant said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Glad you could make it." Barron's heart raced, but he kept his composure. "What do you want, Grant?" Grant took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I told you this wasn't over, didn't I? You've made a fool of me, and now it's time for you to pay." Barron felt the tension rise in the room, but he refused to back down. He had already faced Grant once, and won. He wasn't about to let him intimidate him again. "What are you going to do, Grant?" Barron asked, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "You've already lost. You're just a bully, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." Grant's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Oh, I haven't lost, Barron. Not by a long shot. You think you're the hero here? That you've won? Let's see how long that lasts." Barron felt a chill run down his spine as Grant took another step forward, his hands now clenched into fists. Barron could feel the heat of his anger, but he didn't flinch. "You think you can take me down?" Barron said, his voice louder now, filled with conviction. "I'm not scared of you, Grant. I never was." Grant's eyes flashed with fury, and before Barron could react, Grant lunged at him, throwing a punch aimed directly at his face. Barron dodged just in time, but the move was only the beginning. The fight that Barron had dreaded was finally happening, and this time, he didn't have the element of surprise. Barron ducked and weaved, trying to avoid Grant's attacks. But Grant's crew was closing in. He was outnumbered. And for the first time, Barron felt the pressure of the situation weighing on him. He had faced Grant before, but this was different. Grant wasn't just out for revenge. He was out to destroy Barron. The fight raged on, with Barron doing his best to stay on his feet. The blows kept coming, each one landing harder than the last. His body ached, his breath coming in short gasps, but he refused to give in. This was the test. The moment where he had to prove he wasn't just some rich kid who could be pushed around. But Grant and his friends were relentless. Barron had never been in a fight like this before. He had never been so close to losing control. His mind raced, and for a moment, he wondered if this was it. Was this where it all ended? Was this where the battle that had started in the gym months ago finally took its toll? And then something snapped. Barron, his back against the wall, took a deep breath, focusing everything he had left. His vision cleared, and his body seemed to move on its own. Every move he made was calculated. Every punch he threw was deliberate. He couldn't waste any more energy. With one swift movement, Barron broke free from Grant's grip and landed a hit to Grant's stomach that sent him stumbling backward. Grant's face twisted in shock as he fell to the floor, gasping for air. Barron wasn't sure where the strength came from, but it didn't matter. He had done it. The room went silent, and Barron stood over Grant, breathing heavily, his body covered in bruises and sweat. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't feel fear anymore. He felt power. He had faced Grant Wheeler, and he had won. Again, Grant lay on the floor, struggling to catch his breath, but Barron didn't take his eyes off him. He had proven himself, not to Grant, not to anyone else, but to himself. "This is over, Grant," Barron said, his voice calm but firm. "You're done." As Barron turned to leave, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He knew Grant's crew wasn't finished yet, but he didn't care. He had already won the most important battle. After the dust settled, Barron couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had faced Grant and come out victorious, but in the aftermath, a strange emptiness lingered in his chest. The victory felt like it had been too easy, and yet the pain of the fight still stung. Barron had won the battle, but had he won the war? What did it really mean to stand up for yourself when the world kept throwing punches your way? He wasn't sure anymore. It was easier to fight when you had something clear to push against, like Grant. But life wasn't always that simple. As the days passed, Barron found himself growing more introspective. He spent less time in the halls of Sterling Academy, less time with his classmates. It wasn't that he didn't want to enjoy the victory. It was just that the world felt different now. He had taken a stand, but what had it truly cost him? He had won respect, but was it the kind of respect he wanted? One morning, Barron woke up to a flood of text messages. His phone buzzed relentlessly, each new notification an interruption to his thoughts. Most of the messages were from friends, congratulating him on taking down Grant, but the majority were from strangers, people who had heard the news and wanted to be part of the story. Everyone wanted to be in Barron's circle now that he had proven himself. But the more Barron scrolled to the messages, the more he realized that it wasn't just admiration. There was something darker behind the smiles, the likes, and the congratulations. There were whispers of power, of influence, of what could come next if Barron played his cards right. People wanted to use him, just as they had always wanted to use his father. Barron couldn't shake the feeling that all the attention, all the recognition, came with strings attached. He had fought for his dignity, but now he was faced with a question that had been haunting him since the day he flipped Grant Wheeler. Was this the kind of life he wanted? Later that day, Barron walked through the campus, his mind weighed down with the thoughts he had been avoiding. The school felt like a battlefield now. Every corner he turned, every hallway he entered, he saw faces that watched him a little too intently. But what was worse was the feeling of being caught in the web of expectations. "You okay?" Matt asked as Barron sat down at lunch, his voice tinged with concern. Barron met Matt's eyes, but the weight of everything he'd been carrying suddenly became too much. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something, but he wasn't sure if it was the edge of a cliff or the edge of something new. Either way, it felt like he couldn't breathe. "I don't know, Matt," Barron admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what comes next. Matt studied him for a moment, then spoke softly. "You don't have to have it all figured out, man. You've already done something that a lot of people can't. Stood up for yourself. You're not that kid anymore, Barron. You're someone who's got strength." Barron looked down at his food, his fingers playing with the edge of his napkin. "But what does that mean, though? Strength? Does it mean winning fights? Does it mean getting respect from people who've never cared about me? I don't know if that's enough." Matt's voice was steady, but there was a rawness in it that Barron couldn't ignore. Strength isn't about winning all the time. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. It's about knowing who you really are, not what everyone else wants you to be. Barron looked up at his friend, searching his face for answers, but all he found was sincerity. Matt had always been there for him, but in this moment, Barron realized that the fight he had been waging wasn't just against Grant. It was against the world that expected him to be someone he wasn't. And that was the hardest fight of all. That afternoon, Barron found himself walking alone near the campus's edge, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze and the noise of the school seemed to fade away. The silence was comforting, and for the first time in days, Barron felt at peace. It was here, standing alone among the trees, that Barron allowed himself to think deeply about what he wanted. The world wanted him to be a hero, someone to be admired and followed, someone who made the right moves at the right times. But Barron didn't want that. He didn't want to live in the shadow of his father's legacy or in the shadow of Grant's anger. He wanted something real, something that belonged to him. It was that moment, standing alone in the quiet, when Barron made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to keep living for other people. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even his father's name, dictate who he was. He would carve his own path. And if that meant facing whatever came next alone, then so be it. Barron wasn't just going to survive. He was going to thrive. The following days at Sterling Academy were filled with uncertainty for Barron. His decision to walk away from the constant expectations and pressure had brought him peace, but also left him with a sense of isolation. There were fewer people around him now, fewer people to cheer him on or admire his strength. The applause had died down, and the respect he had fought for now seemed like a distant memory. But Barron didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was starting to understand who he really was. He was no longer bound by the legacy of his father, or the image everyone had projected onto him. He was Barron Trump, the person, not the name. And that was something he had to learn to live with. One afternoon, Barron sat at the edge of the school courtyard, watching his students laugh and mingled. There was a familiar hum of life around him, but it felt different now. Barron had once been a part of that. Someone who followed the crowd, someone who fit in because it was easier. But now he was an outsider. And for the first time, he found solace in that. "You good, man?" Matt's voice broke Barron's reverie. Barron looked up to see Matt walking toward him, a concerned look on his face. He had been there for Barron from the beginning, and it meant more than Barron could express. "I don't know, Matt," Barron replied, rubbing his temples. "I've made my choices, but now it feels like I've lost everything." Matt sat down beside him, his presence grounding Barron. "You haven't lost everything. You've gained yourself. You're not the person you were a month ago. You've stood up for who you are, and that's more than most people ever do." Barron turned to face Matt, the weight of his words sinking in. "But now what? I've fought my battles. I've proved I'm not just a shadow. But now what's left? The world expects so much from me, and I don't even know who I am anymore." Matt's expression softened. "That's the thing about growth, Barron. You don't always have to know what's next. But if you keep being true to yourself, the rest will fall into place. It's okay not to have it all figured out." Barron took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Matt was right. He didn't have to have all the answers. He had already taken the first step toward finding himself, by standing up, by fighting back, by making a choice that was his own. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The following weeks were a blur of reflection and change. Barron continued to attend classes, though he no longer worried about the whispers or the stares. His reputation had shifted. Some people admired him for what he had done, while others still viewed him as a threat. But Barron wasn't concerned with fitting into anyone's mold anymore. He was carving out his own identity. He spent more time with Matt, Emily, and a few other friends, people who had stood by him even when the world seemed to turn against him. They didn't care about his last name or his family's influence. They cared about him, Barron, the person. And for Barron, that was the most valuable thing of all. It was during one of those quiet moments of reflection that Barron received a message from his father. It was brief, almost terse, but it carried a weight that Barron couldn't ignore. "I saw what you did. It was impressive. But remember, the world is watching. Be careful what you choose next." Barron stared at the message, his mind spinning. His father had never been one to offer praise freely. And yet, here it was, his approval, subtle but unmistakable. The words left a bitter taste in Barron's mouth. He had fought so hard to distance himself from his father's shadow, and yet here it was again, looming over him. He tossed his phone onto his bed, frustration building inside him. His father's approval didn't mean much to Barron anymore. He had earned his own respect, made his own decisions, and carved out his own path. But there was still a part of him that wanted to prove to his father that he wasn't just a reflection of his name. He was more than that. Later that night, Barron sat at his desk, the quiet hum of the night surrounding him. He opened his laptop and started typing. He didn't know exactly what he was writing, but it didn't matter. This was his story to tell. His decisions, his consequences, his future. The next morning, Barron sat down with Matt and Emily. He looked at both of them, his heart racing. "I'm doing it," he said quietly. "I'm going to take the next step. I'm going to carve out a life that's my own." Matt smiled, his eyes bright with encouragement. "That's what I've been waiting to hear." Emily nodded in agreement. "You've already proven who you are, Barron. Now it's time to show the world what that means." Barron felt a sense of calm wash over him as he looked at his friends. They were right. He had done the hard part. Now it was time to live his life, to find his place in the world, and to show everyone, including himself, that he was capable of far more than anyone could have imagined. Barron sat in the corner of the library, his fingers tapping against the desk as his thoughts raced. He had finally made the decision to take control of his life, to stop letting others dictate who he was. But now, the weight of that decision felt heavier than ever. He had chosen his path, but the path was unclear. There were no clear answers, no promises of success or happiness. Just a quiet hum of uncertainty, filling the empty space around him. The fight with Grant had changed something inside Barron. It wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore. It was about reshaping the narrative of his life. He had proven to everyone that he wasn't just a product of his last name, but the reality of living without that weight was far more complicated than he'd imagined. As Barron sat there, the door to the library creaked open, and Matt walked in, looking for him. Matt had always been there, the friend Barron could count on. But even Matt could see the change in Barron. His friend wasn't the same person he had been before the fight. He was quieter now, more contemplative, as if the victory over Grant hadn't brought the peace Barron had expected. "Hey," Matt said softly as he sat across from Barron. "You okay?" Barron took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "I think so, but I don't really know anymore, man. I stood up to Grant. Yeah, but now I'm left wondering what happens next. I mean, I got what I wanted, but it doesn't feel like enough." Matt looked at him thoughtfully. "I get it. You've made a huge step, Barron. You've proven you can stand your ground, but now it's time to figure out what you want. Not what your family wants, not what people expect of you, but what you want." Barron nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair. "That's the problem. I don't even know what I want. I've spent so much time trying to be someone else's version of what I should be. Now that I'm finally free from that, I don't know what to do with myself." Matt gave him a small smile. "You'll figure it out. Just remember, no one expects you to have all the answers. Not now and not ever. Take it one step at a time." As the days passed, Barron found himself lost in thought more often than not. His interactions with his classmates had changed. Some people had distanced themselves, while others sought his approval. Now that he was no longer the quiet, rich kid they could walk over. He could feel the shift, but he didn't know how to navigate it. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He didn't want to be the person others admired from afar. All he wanted was to be real. But how could he be real when everything around him was trying to force him into a mold? One day, after school, Barron made his way to the park to clear his mind. The fresh air and open space felt like a brief escape from the pressure. He sat on a bench, watching as people passed by. For a moment, he let himself breathe, feeling the weight lift slightly off his shoulders. But then, a familiar voice interrupted his peace. "Barron?" He turned to find Emily standing in front of him, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. She had always been supportive, ever since the incident with Grant, but Barron hadn't really talked to her much in recent days. "Hey," he said, standing up to greet her. "What's up?" Emily hesitated before speaking, as though choosing her words carefully. "I know you've been going through a lot lately. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I've been worried about you." Barron gave her a small smile, but didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate that, Emily, but I'm fine. I just need to figure things out." Emily looked at him for a long moment, as if studying him. "You know, Barron, you don't have to have everything figured out all at once. The world doesn't expect you to be perfect. You've already shown more strength than most people ever will. Don't let that slip away." Barron took a deep breath. "I don't know, Emily. I feel like there's still so much more I have to prove. To everyone, to myself." Emily placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've already proved who you are, Barron. The rest is just a journey. And I'm here for that journey, if you want me by your side." Barron's heart warmed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of connection. He wasn't alone in this. He didn't have to prove himself to everyone, because there were people who already believed in him. Emily, Matt, his friends, they believed in him. And that was enough. That night, Barron sat in his room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight, the aftermath, the doubts. It had all been part of his journey. A journey he hadn't anticipated, but one that had shaped him into someone stronger. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need them right now. He had already taken the first step toward being himself. The rest would come in time. And when it did, Barron would be ready. Barron is on a path of self-discovery. But what comes next? What do you think he should do now? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're enjoying Barron's journey, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Your support helps us continue telling these powerful stories. Like, share, and join our community today. The weeks that followed Barron's confrontation with Grant and his decision to reclaim his life were filled with unexpected changes. Sterling Academy was no longer the place where Barron felt like an outsider, nor the place where he had been under constant scrutiny. The halls that once seemed so oppressive had transformed into spaces where Barron felt a growing sense of belonging. But it wasn't just the physical school that had changed. It was Barron himself. He had spent so much of his life living in the shadows of his family's name, trying to carve out an identity that was his own. Now, he was learning to live for himself. And it felt like he was finally becoming the person he had always wanted to be. It was a quiet morning when Barron sat down with Matt in their usual spot in the cafeteria. The noise of the school around them had faded into the background, and for the first time in a long time, Barron felt a sense of peace. "I've been thinking," Barron said, breaking the silence, "about everything. The fight, the way things changed. I don't know if I can go back to the way things were. But that's okay, isn't it?" Matt looked up at him, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've already changed, Barron. You don't have to go back. The past doesn't define you. You've proven that." Barron nodded, feeling the weight of Matt's words. "I know, but it's hard. People still look at me differently. Some want me to be the hero. Some just want to see me fail. It's like there's always this pressure to be something I'm not." Matt leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady. "You can't control what people think, Barron, but you can control who you are. You're not a hero. You're just you, and that's enough." Barron thought about this for a moment, the truth of Matt's words sinking in. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some mythical figure that people could project their hopes and fears onto. He was Barron Trump, just a kid trying to figure things out, trying to find his own place in the world. And that was more than enough. Later that day, Barron found himself alone in the library, his mind wandering. He couldn't help but think back to the moment when he had stood up to Grant, when he had finally made the choice to fight for himself. At the time, it had felt like a victory. But now, with the dust settling, Barron realized that the real victory wasn't in the fight itself. It was in the strength he had found inside himself, the courage to stand up, to challenge the world, and to choose his own path. Barron glanced out the window, the sun casting a warm glow over the campus. He had faced the worst that Sterling Academy had thrown at him, and now he was ready for what came next. He didn't know exactly what that would look like, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it. He had come to understand that life wasn't about proving himself to others. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of overcoming whatever came his way. And with that realization, Barron felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. As the semester drew to a close, Barron made a decision that would change the course of his future. He chose to apply to a few prestigious colleges, not because it was expected of him, but because it was something he wanted for himself. He had earned his place in the world, and now it was time to take the next step. But as he sat down to write his college application essay, Barron hesitated. He knew what he had to write. He had to tell his story. The story of how he had fought for his place in the world, how he had faced adversity and come out stronger. But as he typed, something clicked inside him. This wasn't just about the fight with Grant. It was about the journey he had taken to find himself. It was about understanding that he wasn't just a reflection of his father's name or his school's expectations. He was Barron Trump, a young man carving out his own path. Barron sat back and reread the essay he had just written. For the first time, he felt proud of what he had accomplished, not just academically, but personally. He had come a long way from the scared, unsure kid who had once hidden behind the expectations of others. Now, Barron was stepping into his own life, ready to face whatever came next. That evening, as Barron walked out of his room to meet his family for dinner, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken control of his life and created his own future. And no matter what happened, no matter what challenges lay ahead, Barron knew that he was ready. As he sat down at the dinner table, his father gave him a sharp look, as if weighing him with his gaze. Barron met his father's eyes, no longer feeling the weight of expectation that had once hung over him. "You've done well, Barron," his father said, his voice low but unmistakably approving. Barron nodded. "I'm just getting started." And for the first time, Barron truly believed it. Barron has made his choice, and he's ready to embrace his future. What do you think is next for him? Will he be able to live life on his own terms? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you're following Barron's journey, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to keep up with the next chapter. Your support helps us tell more inspiring stories. Share and join our community today.